Peace, everyone. Can folks hear me? Just want to make sure before I get started. Okay, great. Um, Hello and welcome to the BAP North, the Black Alliance for Peace Northeast webinar, regional webinar. My name is JP, and I am one of the co-organizers of the Northeast region of the Black Alliance for Peace. As an organization, the Black Alliance for Peace seeks to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the radical Black movement. And through educational activities, organizing, and movement support, organizations and individuals in the Alliance work to oppose militarized domestic oppression, state repression, and the policies of destabilization, subversion, and the permanent war agenda of the United States state globally. But before we really get into it, I wanted to just make a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, for folks who are engaging in the chat, we just ask that you please be respectful of others, no disrespect. And then second of all, if you have a question, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar because there's going to be a lot to chew on from some of our great panelists tonight. If you do have a question, we really want you to make sure that you use the Q&A feature. The Q&A feature is where you should be able to see somewhere in the webinar settings a little box that says Q&A. And if you do have a question, make sure you put it there as opposed to putting it in the chat, because if you put it in the chat, it might get lost, and we definitely want to have the opportunity to address any questions that you may have that come up during our time tonight. Let's see here. I want to start in an unlikely place and time. London, November 1861. And sorry for the confusion. This picture is not from there. I'll say a little bit more about the picture, but yeah. London, November 1861. The United States had just become disunited. Civil War had broken out, and John Sella Martin, a Black abolitionist who freed himself from an Alabama plantation and became a pastor in Boston, addressed a hushed crowd of Londoners who wanted to know what was going on across the pond. One audience member wanted to know why the North would participate in a fratricidal war. Reverend Martin pauses, takes in the question, and calmly replies, "Slavery is a chronic state of war." Slavery is a chronic state of war. And if our brother, comrade, and veteran fighter of the Black liberation struggle, Jalil Muttaqim, is right about the United States still being a slave nation, then we remain still in a chronic state of war. The Black Alliance for Peace Northeast region defines war as the strategic invasion, destabilization, dispossession, and at times elimination of a community, its people, its land, its resources, its culture, its customs, and its agency by ideological, armed, economic, and psychological means. To feed their bottomless hunger, the ruling class uses war to loot and hoard the world's resources, to control and direct all phenomenon, that is, acquire power, and to restrict and dictate the trajectories of the lives of the subjugated. War, as executed by the US, EU, NATO axis of domination, is an ongoing counter-revolution aimed at suppressing African and colonized people who are seeking to acquire power and win their own liberation. War's tactics are ideological, political, and social. They include gentrification, sanctions, blockades, militarized policing, surveillance, U.S. combatant commands like AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM, colonial conquest and expropriation, censorship, the proliferation and use of nuclear weapons, mass enslavement and chattelization, child removal, environmental destruction, Jim Crow legislation, lynching, redlining, corporate media control, mass incarceration, assassination, elimination of food sovereignty, white supremacist vigilantism, volunteerism, and deputization, sexual assault, information warfare, forced sterilization, indoctrination, violent repression of dissent, counterinsurgency, coups, propaganda, etc., etc. While the social and political tactics of war are apparent and devastating, it's the ideological tactics of war, that is indoctrination, propaganda, censorship, information warfare, corporate media control, etc., that serve to maintain oppressive structures and hierarchies through the conditioning of African and colonized peoples. Now, that definition is a mouthful, it's thick, and it is that on purpose. Tonight, we are going to hear from 4 brilliant panelists who will break down these 4 means by which war is waged: ideological, armed, economic, and psychological. And so first, we wanted to start with ideological, and to tell us about the ideological means by which war is waged, we want to go to Jibo Sobukwe, who is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Philadelphia Citywide Alliance and a longtime freedom fighter and revolutionary intellectual. So I will pass it to Jibo and we'll get started.
Okay, thank you very much, JP. So I'll be setting up my slides. And so my piece of this presentation on war is the ideological factor, the ideological war. This presentation will include various characterizations of what ideology is, the ideological war, the importance of ideological struggle, as stated by some really great revolutionary left heroes. And we will apply that analysis then to some of our local conditions here in Philadelphia. So we'll go to the next slide. Our first slide is, as revolutionaries, dialectical materialists, we always start with what the material base of ideology is. And the material base is the economic base. And there are 2 quotes that are really instructive that were given by Marx and Engels in their book called German Ideology. The first quote is, "The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. So thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it." Now, when he says mental production, he also says intellectual production, so he uses those interchangeably. And then the next quote, "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas." So that's important to remember as a basis as we go on in this presentation and in general in talking about ideology. So to talk a little bit more about the economic base, we have to break down what Marxists define as the 4 forces and mode of production. The forces of production are the means of production and labor power in their interaction. That is, the working masses, including their tools and technology and knowledge. The mode of production characterizes the class relationships people have with one another, which is conditioned by who owns and controls what is produced, whether the majority own or a minority own. And, in a capitalist society like this one, very small minority own the lion's share of what is produced. And even, the top 10% hold approximately 67% of the wealth, of the total wealth. So that's typical of capitalism. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So now, what is ideology? In a capitalist society, obviously, since that's the mode of production, they produce capitalist ideology. In Kwame Nkrumah's book, Consciencism, he offers several defining characteristics of ideology, which can be summarized in the following way. First, he says, the ideology of a society is total and displays itself in a political theory, economic theory, social theory, and moral theory, and uses these as instruments and principles guiding a behavioral code of conduct. Ideology aims at uniting the actions of millions towards specific goals, although an ideology can be largely implicit. In other words, it doesn't have to be all written down, although in our case, a lot of it is written down. Ideologies are not necessarily a body of ideas written down on paper, and the fact that it may not be does not prevent it from being one. Now, this last one is important. Revolutionary ideology does not merely express that a present social order be abolished, it also seeks to defend and maintain a new social order, which it introduces. So in the case of Black Alliance for Peace, we have our principles of unity, which are an ideological weapon that BAP uses to defend and advocate a new social order where those principles and values are the status quo, as opposed to what we have now, which is a very repressive ideology. And that's one of the reasons Martin Luther King advocated for a revolution of values. So Nkrumah talks at length about this in his book, Consciencism. Next slide. So here in this slide, I'm adding 3 more revolutionary heroes. The first one is Sekou Touré. And actually, all 3 of these heroes were pretty ideologically close. They're good comrades. Sekou Touré said in his book, Strategy and Tactics of the Revolution, that ideological training and revolutionary ideology is the modern weapon used by the oppressed people to overcome their insufficiencies, to meet the challenge of exploiting powers. Revolutionary ideology is the infallible arm that reveals and develops a people's genius. Cabral and Sekou Touré said that book was published in the 70s. Cabral as well said, the value of culture as an element of resistance to foreign domination lies in the fact that culture is the vigorous manifestation on the ideological or idealist plane of the physical and historical reality of the society that is dominated or to be dominated. And that's in Return to the Source. Those of you who have studied some Cabral know that book. And then many people don't realize that Fidel Castro also is known for his statement on the Battle of Ideas, advocating for the Battle of Ideas. But in 1999, Fidel Castro made a historic speech in Venezuela called "A Revolution Can Only Be Born from Culture and Ideas." And this is a quote from that speech. He says, however, and he's talking about the US, was unable to defeat a united people, a people armed with just ideas, a people endowed with great political consciousness, because that is most important for us. We have resisted everything and are ready to continue resisting as long as need be. thanks to the seeds planted throughout those decades, thanks to the ideas and the consciousness developed during that time. And on the left, two of my favorite pictures, one with Sekou Touré and Fidel Castro, and the second one with Amilcar Cabral and Fidel Castro. And as we know, this quote by Fidel was made in 1999, and at that time, both Sekou Touré and Cabral had passed. Cabral was assassinated in 1973 in Guinea, and Sekou Touré passed in 1984. Okay, next slide. So the last heroic revolutionary, Kwame Ture on the Battle of Ideas. Now we know Kwame Ture was mentored by Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, so it's no surprise that he had something to say about this topic of ideological struggle. And in an interview he gave in 1991, he was very clear about it. And he said, the real struggle is an ideological struggle, a struggle of which ideas should dominate. These ideas clash in the human form of men and women in war, on picket lines, in sit-ins, in boycotts, and in armed struggle. But one should not think that when one doesn't see this human manifestation of struggle, that the struggle is no longer there. On the contrary, some of the most important aspects of the struggle are those which appear to be missing, the ideological struggle. And in a few slides down, we'll give you an example of a picket line, actually, where you can see where this struggle he's talking about is evident. But he says, even if you don't see that, it doesn't mean it's not there. So this is my personal graphic where I have collected the ideas of the heretofore mentioned heroes that describe this whole ideological struggle paradigm. And this diagram I call the cultural pyramid of class struggle and dialectical motion. So to start to explain this pyramid, I first start with the economic base, just like the first slide I came to with the quotes of Marx and Engels. Their quotes in the German ideology, where they say the class that controls the material means of production also controls the mental or intellectual means of production. So the material means of production are right here at the bottom in blue, where it says forces and motor production, which I already defined. That's the economic base. And the yellow part of this pyramid is what Marxists call the superstructure. And that Nkrumah, Touré, Cabral call ideology and culture, and as well as Fidel. So the struggle in this pyramid is depicted by two sides of the pyramid. On the right side, in the superstructure, we have the counter-revolutionary reactionary culture and ideology that is constantly battling the left side, which is the revolutionary progressive culture and ideology. And each side have morals, values, philosophy, and politics. But of course, in this society, in U.S. racial capitalist society, the right side vastly dominates the left side. But just so I could get the words in, I made it so that it's a even split between the two. But we know that fascist ideology vastly dominates progressive and revolutionary ideology. But just to give you an idea of this constant struggle. And like Kwame Ture said in that previous slide, it's it's obvious when you see a picket line, when a union strikes against the capitalist employer. That's an obvious class struggle. But class struggle also happens on the level of morals and values. And that's why Martin Luther King said, this country has horrible values and we need a revolution of values. So that struggle occurs on the philosophical level, the level of values, the level of morals, the level of politics, even the level of religion, where reactionary religion or liberatory religion on the left. And at the top of the pyramid, we have the cultural personality, customs, language, and nationalism. Now, that word cultural personality is not just put there casually. That concept is talked about extensively by Cabral, Sekou Touré, Nkrumah, and even Fanon. So that's all part of the superstructure, and it's in a constant fight. One, the oppressive fight against the resistance, because as the dialectical law explains, that wherever there's oppression, there's some resistance. Even if we can't notice the resistance, it's there in various forms. Okay, next slide. So here we have Black Alliance for Peace's ideological weapons, our principles of unity. And I won't name them all: right to self-defense, self-determination, Black radical peace tradition, decolonization, prisoner support, Southern roots, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, working class foundation, that's important, anti-patriarchy, intersectionality, and Black unity. And so these principles belong on the left side of that pyramid because they're constantly fighting racial capitalist values and principles. And these are our ideological weapons, in addition to our people-centered human rights concepts and ideas. So now I want to move to apply this analysis to the local area of Philadelphia. And as we say here, an analysis of the local ideological war. This analysis requires us unmasking certain ideological pitfalls. One of the big ideological pitfalls right here in this city among many Black people, not all, but many, is that the majority Black political misleader class, including the mayor and city council, operate as ideological cover for the control of big capital. And also because we have a Black woman mayor, Black female identity reductionism is a cover for neocolonial misleader manifested in the current mayor. And this is just a common phrase that our people know. Skin folk ain't always your kinfolk. And that might sound like a simple phrase, but actually it breaks down the concept that biology is not the same as ideology, and ideology should take precedence over biology. Meaning that, so when we say your kinfolk, we're talking about kinfolk that share our principles, kinfolk that share our values, kinfolk that share our ethics. That's what's important. That should supersede a unity over just plain skin folk. Because we know, if we think about that pyramid again, we have skin folk on the right side and we have skin folk on the left side. But we have to decide, using ideological analysis, that we are going to side with the kinfolk on the left side. And that's why we're calling them the kinfolk. And this might be how we have to break it down to some people who are not necessarily grasping a more sophisticated revolutionary vocabulary. So anyway, I'm going to move on to some prime examples in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia mayor is controlled by big capital, probably not unlike many mayors in the country. But in the case of Philadelphia, it's in the form of the Building Trades Council that represents over 50 unions, many of which have racist and corrupt history. Some at some points were even dominated by organized crime. This, in addition to the powerful local Zionist lobby from the start of the mayor's campaign to the present. We can recall that in Philly, City Council voted to condemn the Hamas counterattack against Israel on 19 October 2023. The fact that in 24, they could not even agree or pass a ceasefire resolution while Israel continued to commit a genocide. So you see how strong the ideological hold is on the misleadership class. Philly participated in the deadly exchange programs between Philly Police Department and the IDF training, which is shown to increase police abuse as exemplified in the murder of George Floyd, IDF being the Israeli Defense Force. And the mayor also implemented the stop and frisk policing, which was very controversial, but she insisted on it. And this facilitates the school to prison pipeline. Okay, and this picture is the picture of demonstrators at the time. It's out of the Philly paper at the time that city council couldn't even pass a ceasefire and when they voted to condemn Hamas. So we continue with this example. And this example is a real critical example. Remember when I read Kwame Ture's quote, he mentioned picket lines. Well, Philadelphia had a famous strike in July of 2025, which there were picket lines of one of the biggest unions. This was the abuse of the DC 33 Philadelphia Sanitation Workers Union, the largest in the city, went on strike in July of 2025, lasted 8 days, and was ended due to pressure from the mayor, who utilized court injunctions to compel striking workers to settle while not giving them a living wage, but telling the public, and here comes the ideological schmooze, telling the public that they got the average wage for a city of our size and other BS, while the facts show that it was not a living wage, since the cost of living in Philadelphia is higher than the national average. The cost of living in Philadelphia are 14% higher than the US national average. And one of the points the union wanted was to be allowed to live outside of the city boundary, and the mayor struck that down. And the reason they wanted to be able to live outside is because housing costs in Delaware County are more affordable. You can get a nicer house for your money, but she refused. The primary drivers of Philadelphia's cost of living are soaring housing costs, elevated transportation expenses, and food prices. And on the right side is a picture of the president of DC 33. His name is President Greg Boulware. And he said that he wasn't satisfied with the deal at the time. He wanted his members to know that union leadership fought hard for what they believed they deserved. But unfortunately, as a result of pressure and coercion by the mayor, they had to settle for less than a living wage. And this is my last example, although there are others, but I'll leave it here. The last example is that Philadelphia this year will be hosting the World Cup Soccer, which is organized by the corrupt FIFA organization. And FIFA stands for the International Football Federation Association. That's the French acronym. And they're the same ones who gave Trump a peace award, by the way, so you know they're corrupt and controlled by US and NATO forces. This will be an opportunity for them, however, to pump patriotism as part of the ideological propaganda war in the city, all while waging war on the working class who couldn't even afford a ticket if they wanted to go. All people who are against the U.S. warmongering all over the world in U.S. involvement in Zionist genocide should boycott the World Cup being held here. And when I say here, I mean the U.S. Black Alliance for Peace was in the leadership of organizing the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition, demanding that FIFA immediately remove the 2026 World Cup matches from the United States and calling on the international community to boycott the United States as a host nation for international sporting events. And here comes again the ideological brainwashing and propaganda that somehow, people are made to think that international sport is not politically neutral, or that it is politically neutral, I should say, but even though it's not, obviously. Mega sporting events generate legitimacy, they normalize state violence and mask repression under the language of unity and celebration. We call on BAP and the People-Centered Human Rights, call on all to endorse the campaign. For more information on this campaign, go to peoplecenteredhumanrights.com/move the games. And on the right side of this this statement, I have a picture of the Haitian soccer team. Now, Haiti, even though it's a small island, they qualified for the World Cup, and they're due to play in Philadelphia. They're scheduled to play in Philadelphia in June. However, we're hoping that there's enough pressure for the international community, from the international community, to shut down the games, the World Cup here in the U.S. FIFA has already canceled many hotel rooms in Philadelphia. That's been latest news in the last week. So nobody knows why, but they're hoping that other fans will come. The other thing about the Haitian team is it's so insidious. Haitian fans are not allowed to get a visa to come and watch the team play, and they're not the only team that's banned like that. There are others. So this is horrible. This country doesn't deserve to host the games. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Here are some further readings for people who can check them out. And I thank you.
Appreciate that, Comrade Jibo. And we'll have more to say about the Move the Games campaign toward the end. But yeah, appreciate that. Ideological means by the ideological means by which war is waged is critical. It's foundational, and that's why we definitely wanted you to set the tone for us, and we appreciate that. Next, we are going to move to the economic means by which war is waged, and we are going to have Justin and Frames, who are also members of the Black Alliance for Peace Northeast, and they're also members of an organization that is a member organization of the Black Alliance for Peace called the Black Socialist Formation. And so I will yield the floor to Justin and Frames, and we'll learn about the economic means by which war is waged against our people.
Yeah, thank you, JP. Appreciate it, comrade. Can y'all see the screen all right?
Yes.
Sounds good. Okay, cool. Yeah, peace, y'all. I'm Frames. Like JP just said, Justin and I will
Is it
be.
showing the notes for everybody? It feels like it's showing the notes. Is that?
Oh, sorry. Let me try that one more time.
It always gets me. There we go.
Is that good now? Thank you, appreciate it. Yeah, so yeah, Frames and Justin and I will be tag teaming to talk about economic war in the settler capital class, the state, dispossession, and oppression, and we'll be kind of doing a closer look into Pittsburgh. That's where we're based at, the BSF here, and looking specifically at the Lower Hill District section of the Hill District neighborhood in Pittsburgh, which is a historically Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh. So to begin, Comrade Jibo mentioned the BAP principles of unity. And so for this section, we wanted to highlight this one, which is the anti-capitalism principle. And this one is BAP believes that capitalism as a mode of production is inherently exploitative and oppressive. Therefore, it is incompatible with human freedom and fundamental people-centered human rights and must be opposed. So to get into a little bit about capitalism and, kind of a more broad understanding of the relations under capitalism, we thought this formula might be useful for folks, and it's useful for us for sure, which is the CMC and MCM, Marx's formula for interaction with commodities, right? So when we look at this CMC, it's a C, which is a commodity going to money, going to another commodity. This one describes the workers' relationship to commodities. And what's being said with the CMC is that workers have a commodity that we are forced to sell, which is our labor. That's the main commodity that the working class has to offer to sell. We sell that labor for wages or salaries, right? To get money, and we use that money to purchase the commodities we need to survive, or some of the things we might want, things we desire, but increasingly more and more the case, most of the money that we're able to get from our wages and our salaries, we're using that to survive. And even that isn't enough to make our survival, right? At the same time, the relation that the capitalist class has to these commodities is different, right? They have, when we see this MCM, what's happening is the capitalists have money, use this money to pay for commodities which they will use to make more money, right? So the commodities they purchase are one, our labor power, which was mentioned earlier, right? But also the factories, the machines, right? The means of production that are all necessary in the process of producing more commodities, producing products that have value. And their goal as a class is to sell these commodities that are produced from this labor for more than what they initially started out with. So that's why you see here this red asterisk next to the second M in the MCM, is that it's really important to understand, is like essential to this formula, is understanding that the incentive for the capitalist class to make this investment, right, to put money in to buy commodities, is they want to end up at the end with more money than they started with. And that's what makes it worth it for them. But we want to also complicate this a little more for how it relates to Africans specifically. And so, Justin, I'll pass it to you for it.
Good, bet. Yeah, thanks, Frames. Yeah, so what we wanted to do is kind of stay with the BAP definition of war, and say, the MCM, or this, CMC, MCM piece, Marx kind of models that looking at like, an industrial space in London, but there's also, though, I think when it comes to African people, there's more going on than just this wage relation. So we have here also that racial capitalism, or this built-in kind of racialism of Europe, is what Cedric R. Robinson argues, that they're already racialist even among themselves, and then it expresses itself in capitalism. So that's always a back and forth of which was first, whatever. But we think that's important because we're going to experience a different kind of war in capitalism because of that aspect, because African people are particularly targeted. Right now, if you look in the world, in the effects in the world in terms of who has resources and who does not, you can see this play out. And then there's the issue of settler colonialism here, where capitalism grows here, but not just, again, in the factory. It grows taking the land from indigenous people and then using African labor. And all of this, I think, leads to something Marx calls as primitive accumulation. And so when BAP has the definition of it's inherently exploitative and oppressive, there's this other category beyond labor exploitation, which we're saying, you can put this issue of oppression um, in this understanding of capitalism, which carries a lot in that. We'll keep talking about that, but that's the piece that we wanted to mention. I see Erica there, talking about the capitalist racism. So it's would add even more. So maybe some folks can bring that up in the question and answer. Let's go to the next slide. So, one of the things that we're going to talk about is how you see, one of the elements of this war is the state, and you can see that in the lower hill. But again, in the definition, our definition of war, we talk about the U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination, right? Which we offer, I think, and would be agree with I would say a lot of people here, that's an expression of a capitalist state, different state apparatuses by which this war is carried out. And so, the slide here says, having accumulated capital, the capital class develops, in quotes, an armed body of men. That's from Lenin, and other elements of a capitalist state apparatus to expand and reproduce their power, particularly over African and non-European peoples, to dispossess and oppress. So again, going back to this notion of war. So what are the tools of war? And the state is another critical tool of war. And once the capital class, this dispossession and exploitation kind of go together in a circle. Steal, use the money to then buy the means of productions and exploit labor, use the things that you raise from capital in that version and use it to steal more. And so that's an ongoing cycle. And so we think that's a critical aspect of the war, and how capitalism relates to that war. And one more slide, I think. Yeah. And so then, with the state in their hands, a lot of different kinds of disposition of African people can happen. So mass incarceration, segregation, so-called convict leasing, all these are tools to dispossess. So we're kind of zeroing in, dispossessing you of your labor, of your freedom, of your land, of your rights to kind of fully take advantage of well, that's a whole other story whether you want to take advantage of this, but that there is this the aspect of the war is how the state is used to dispossess, because dispossess and oppress is in our definition of war. And so we're just kind of be zeroing in on this dispossession and oppression. And we just kind of wanted to set up those two elements. And then when we zero into the lower hill district, kind of keep that in your mind, like the state, dispossession, oppression. Behind that, though, is another group of people. And we think you can see that in the lower hill district. And I'll kick it back to you, Frames.
Yeah. And so, like Justin said, we're going to zero in and kind of look at a particular story that a lot of folks from Pittsburgh know, folks from outside the area might not know as well. But a lot of what we saw is what is the dispossession of the Hill District, of the Lower Hill specifically, of Africans in the Lower Hill District, and a specific look at it from this angle where we're looking at this dispossession and oppression that Justin was just talking about. So a quick note is just in the 50s and the 60s, we talk about, if you've heard about the urban renewal program, capital class members like Richard King Mellon and Jack Hines like the ketchup people, utilized the state, right, through the city of Pittsburgh, and also private entities, to force 8,000 Black and African people and 400 businesses out of the Lower Hill District as part of this urban renewal program. Where James Baldwin is known for saying that urban renewal means Negro removal, right? So we see this taking place in the 50s, beginning in the 50s and taking place through the 50s and 60s. And they talked about these plans of a renaissance of the Lower Hill, but the 28 acres that were taken held nothing but a hockey arena, the civic arena, and some parking lots from '67 up until very recently. So this is just a quick picture of that, but like Justin said, there's when we look at Mellon and Hines, there's this class of people who are behind this dispossession specifically.
Yeah, so these are two folks, Richard King Mellon and Jack Hines II, and they end up working through this thing called the Allegheny Conference on Development, which is a 501c3, and then also to create the plan, then working with the state via the city of Pittsburgh to pass and be able to dispossess. And of course, this is a national struggle. So of course, you saw this with almost any city that you were in. There'd be different members of the same class, I think, which shows that it's a national struggle because you couldn't have this many coincidences. So yeah, I'll kick it back to you, Frames.
Yeah, so just wanted to show this picture of what the lower hill looked like before, pretty much right before a lot of the demolition, the dispossession was taking place here, right? So this is an image of the lower hill in the middle, some images on the sides of what the community looked like. The one in the top right is a historic African or Black church. It's called the African Church, founded in the early 19th century by African people who settled in or who lived in the hill, right? See a comment that it looks like Harlem. We've read, I wasn't there, but it was called Little Harlem by members of the hill and people in the area in the time, right? And these are nice pictures, beautiful pictures for sure. But we also think it's important to tell the other part of the story, which is something that we see in African communities throughout this empire and beyond, honestly, is the targeted, right, disinvestment, intentional blighting, intentional neglect of these communities that makes living conditions harder and harder and harder for the people living in it, right? So that was what was taking place in the Lower Hill during this time. It's a story we're familiar with in cities all throughout, right? In all the cities and many of the African communities that we know. And it's a common strategy of the capital class and of capitalism and imperialism to do this, to disrupt, to destabilize, to contribute to worsening the living conditions for African peoples, for oppressed peoples in an area, and using that then as a justification to take the land, right? To take the land that people are living on, making lives on, surviving on. And so this is what the hill looked like through a lot of that process of so-called urban renewal, right? So these are people's homes, these are people's, businesses, communities, and in the top right, that's that same church, right? In the top left is an image of I believe the celebration of the beginning of the urban renewal that was taking place in the lower hill, right? And so what you can see here is this intentional, right, destruction of our communities, which what we're trying to point out, right, when we talk about dispossession, this is an oppressive manifestation of capitalism, and it shows the specific oppression of African peoples under capitalism. So it's really important to see here, right? You saw on the slide that Justin spoke earlier about was an image of Libya after NATO strikes in 2011, right? So what I'm saying there is we see this image and we can recognize this kind of dynamic in so many different instances of imperialism, of capitalist oppression, of African peoples, of oppressed and indigenous peoples all throughout, right, the world, right, not just within the empire. Yeah, and so all the while, right, there was resistance to this. Africans in the Hill did fight back against this and speak out against this. The image on the left is an image of a protest for job opportunities around the civic arena that was built on this land that was renewed, so to speak, where this disposition was taking place. On the right, later toward the end of the 60s, this was a billboard that was put up by members of the Hill District community, demanding that there is no redevelopment past this point, past this corner of Crawford Street and Center Ave. And this is just another image of some more of this so-called redevelopment. To the left, the three images to the left are images of the construction of and the finishing of the civic arena that existed for a couple of decades, right, from the late 60s to just around 2010, when it stopped serving as the home of the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Penguins then moved to PPG Paints Arena, which was constructed not too long before 2010, in the same area, right? And the two images in the bottom right are taken straight from Pittsburgh's Urban Renewal Authority website, showing some of the plans and the progress for some more of this redevelopment today. Yeah, so pass it to Justin.
Yeah, I'm going to sum this up pretty quickly. Just kind of keeping this same piece around, well, how is the war expressed? In 2007, Ravenstall, who was the mayor at the time, he sells the Penguins, who's at this time led by these two folks, Mary Lemieux and Ron Burkle. Burkle, a major Democrat funder. They sell the development rights to the Penguins for $1. So this land that was once peopled by African people goes for $1 to this group right here. Next slide. And so then in 2025, this is just this past fall, the Fenway Group sells the development rights, gives the development rights it inherited from Lemieux and Burkle, and sells them to the Penguins, to the Hoffman Group. That's who now open it. So it's a new phase of now for the Hill District. Hoffman's worth about $2 billion, John Henry about $5 billion. Let's go to the next slide. So the dispossession elements of war, although carried out by state bureaucratic figures, it couldn't be possible without armed bodies of men. Nobody cares about city council meetings, and if it wasn't someone who's behind that, right? And so the capital class is doing these things and taking the lower hill, but there's a group behind them that is letting everyone know that you have to behave certain ways in the city council meetings and accept certain decisions and protest in certain kinds of ways. Next slide. Just one thing real quickly, I just want to go back. We don't have to go back and slide, but Lemieux bought the Penguins for $107 billion in '99, and then Fenway Group buys it for $900 million in 2021, and it was just sold for $1.7 billion. This land that went for the rights to the Africans were on for $1, and the Hill District never got a single penny. Right? It just went for $1.7 billion. So there we have the economic aspect of war. But a last thing about it, which is that this thing on oppression. So we've done the way exploitation, but the oppression actually is beyond quantifiable, right? And I think you could even argue it's also ideological. So I think it's really important how we interpret these struggles so that we don't interpret them in ways that actually reinforce the ideological aspect that we can't win. And I really appreciate what Iran has been doing in Hamas as well, in terms of how you define victory, right? And victory can be survival against a group like this, right? How do you use it to go forward, but to understand that none of these local campaigns are actually a local campaign. They're against a much larger capital class, and how we fight needs to be put in those terms. So thanks for the time.
Appreciate that, Justin and Frames. Thank you for laying out very clearly the economic war on our people, and specifically how it manifests for African folks and has manifest. One of the things in our definition that we list out in that long list of tactics, that when we say that war is ideological, social, and political, is that et cetera at the last part. And I feel like that you all sort of laid out in clear detail like how the various tactics used to wage economic warfare against us, they really expanded on that. And yeah, so thank you for that. And now want to shift gears quickly to the armed means by which war is waged. And for that, we are going to go to Comrade Josh, also known as my right-hand man. And he is a member of Community Movement the Newark chapter of Community Movement Builders. And he's going to tell us about the armed means by which war is waged. And it will be grounded in the experience of folks in Newark, New Jersey. So, Josh, I'll share the screen and take it away.
Can you hear me? I know I was having audio issues before.
Yeah.
Good. All right, cool, beautiful. So yeah, peace, comrades. I'm also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace, New Jersey, New York City, Citywide Alliance, if you forgot to mention. But yeah, no, I'm based here in Newark, and today, definitely want to talk about armed means, specifically through examples of, how the state uses it against us, and then examples of how, Africans have used it against the state, right? So first, just want to kind of start with just thinking about armed means, like what does that even mean? How do we define that? So just kind of, started with a simple Webster's definition. And unfortunately, I didn't have a beautiful presentation like everyone else, so I'll know that for next time. But the Webster's definition, furnished with weapons, furnished with something that provides security, strength, or efficacy, right? So when we're thinking about that armed, we're thinking about, weapons, violence in that way. But also want to ground us in kind of how we talk about for our campaign that JP will talk about a little bit later, the No Compromise, No Retreat campaign. So BAP, in describing that, talks about that the structural crisis of capitalism in its neoliberal form. So when you think of neoliberal, think of increased privatization, decreased public spending, has created a legitimacy crisis for the capitalist rules, making the use of force a permanent strategy for maintaining their dominance, right? So that use of force is how we're understanding armed means, right? And so as you can see, like throughout the world, right, with all as these contradictions have kind of come up, right? So you're seeing in various different places, right? So think about the war in Iran, think about the attacks against the sovereignty of Cuba, of Venezuela, think about, current increased ICE presence currently right now, right? Force has been increasingly had because of this kind of crisis, because of people understanding that, things are not going well and things are not going as how they should, right? And so wanted to dive in first with kind of this past example, and this is where these pictures come from here. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the occupation of Newark by the National Guard during the Newark Rebellion. And so that's where these pictures come from here. This happened in 1967. The Newark Rebellion was from July 12th to July 17th. And so it was a period in which African Black people in Newark rose up initially because of the police beating of John Smith. And so John Smith was a taxi driver. I think he maybe made a traffic violation or something, allegedly. And then they took him out the car, beat him up, and arrested him. That was kind of like the tip of the spear in terms of causing folks to mobilize, to go out to protest, and to kind of cause this rebellion within the city, right? And so important to note, and I think this definitely connects to the economic piece as well, is that like because of current conditions, right, tensions were already high, right? So a community member during that time, Junius Williams, Newark Community Union member, he said that people were mad, angry. The contradictions were too clear at that point in America. So there was an explosion, right? So think about 1967. Think about, the Black Power movement. Think about the Civil Rights movement, right? People identifying that there are these contradictions, right? That things are not the way that they should be. Then specifically in Newark, right? As the comrades talked a little bit about dispossession, that was happening in Newark as well, right? So specifically around there's a proposed building of this new medical school that was going to displace 10% of the population in Newark. There was obviously other different kind of economic crises going in Newark, right? So these things are bubbling up. There was also continued police brutality generally, right, in Newark. And so this kind of was a catalyst that resulted into this rebellion, right? And so after the first day of kind of protest, there was of kind of this rebellion against the current conditions that were happening. The National Guard was sent for New Jersey, and it resulted in 1,000 civilians injured and 26 folks killed. And I think what's really interesting about this is how the governor at the time, Governor Hughes of New Jersey, talked about his decision in terms of sending the National Guard in. And so this comes from, I think a link was shared in the chat, Rise Up Newark. Definitely a valuable resource, historical resource in terms of learning about Newark. And so, what they describe it as, upon touring the area, Governor Hughes described the riot as a criminal insurrection against society, hiding behind the shield of civil rights, and issued proclamations declaring Newark to be in a state of emergency. Hughes established a curfew, prohibited the sale and possession of alcohol, restricted travel within the city, and directed police and National Guard to take any and all measures requisite to quell disturbances and outbreaks of violence, right? So I really want to key in on this point of like what Hughes says is that it's a criminal insurrection against society, right? So as we think about what people were responding to, they're responding to their current conditions. They're responding to this dispossession that Comrades Frames and Justin were talking about, right? They're responding to this police brutality. And so the state, effectively Hughes, right, is understanding those conditions as that is just the status quo. That is how our society should work. And so if someone revolts against that, right, then we need to put that down. And that's why, again, as we kind of as what I talked about a little bit earlier, is like, you know, these crises, these contradictions come up, then that's when the armed force comes down even further, right? Because they want to control and restrict us, right? And so even thinking back to that JP talked about a little bit earlier, or the specific piece that I want to highlight is where it says, uses war to control and direct all phenomena, acquire power, and to restrict and dictate the trajectories of the lives of the subjugated, right? So that's what the National Guard coming in is to do, right? To restrict people, to control what is going on. They don't want any disruption in terms of their capitalist rules, right? And so moving on, I wanted to talk currently, right? Thinking about, you know, what's happening in Newark, what's happening currently in the U.S. context. And so I wanted to talk just about state-sanctioned police violence, right? And so starting with that, I think there's a great resource called Mapping Police Violence that I think it started in 2013, where they kind of just map in terms of the police killings that we've seen since then. And so in 2025, just starting with that, 300 Black people were killed by police in 2025. I think it's actually like 1,200 in total, right, of all people within the U.S., right? So if you think about that 300, right, that's like a person per day, right? And so thinking about that specifically here in Newark, unfortunately, earlier this year, on MLK Day, a community member by the name of Wally Bay was murdered by Newark police. And so, you know, Newark police, they were on an investigation, quote unquote, arresting folks in the area. Wally, in fear of his life, tried to escape via his car. As he's escaping, a cop shoots in his car 5 times, killing Bay and then injuring another passenger, right? And so I think of note for this is, you know, they released the body cam footage of this about a week or two ago. And as we're thinking about war, right, like I think what is interesting is that as you're listening to the body cam footage, they're referring to the people that they're arresting as targets, right? So thinking about that as in war, right? When whoever you're targeting to kill, right? And so that's again how they're seeing this as this is war against us as African Black people. And then another interesting point from the body cam footage is that as you're seeing them, you know, allegedly arresting the targets, as they call it, there are like people onlooking, right? They're just kind of randomly just minding their own business. And as this is happening, they're arresting those folks as well, right? So again, seeing them as targets, seeing them as, you know, people that they need to arrest, they need to control, they need to restrict. And so I bring this up to say that this is like again, as we're talking about the civil society that is being attacked, right? This is the current state. This is what this system does by design, right? And so if we understand ourselves at war by design, we need to understand ourselves that we are at war in terms of understanding how to respond to that, right? And so another example I wanted to bring up, so as we know, right, like ICE has been ramping up this year and this past year, right? I mean, honestly, even before then, right? And thinking about ICE as another form of policing, right? So ICE is the police as well. And so specifically here in Newark, we had someone that was detained, John Wilson Brutus, who was a Haitian man that lived a couple cities away from here, specifically in Newark. And, you know, definitely take of note that he was Haitian, right? Considering Haiti's history, considering what is going on in Haiti now. And so he was detained, and then a day later, he died in ICE custody, right? And so as they're talking about, you know, his death and what happened, of note is that they're bringing up some previous arrests that he had previously before, where police were harassing him for different violations or et cetera, as if that's justification for him to be for him to die in ICE custody, as if it doesn't matter, right? And so I bring these examples up to again to help us lay out that this armed means is being used against us, and that it helps us to understand that we are at war, right? They're calling us targets. If they're utilizing these kind of various different instances of being afoul of the law in terms of to justify our death, then we should understand that specifically at war. And I want to bring a quote from Jackie Lukman, our chair of the Coordinating Committee for the Black Alliance for Peace, that kind of like crystallizes again like what policing in this current society is supposed to do in the U.S., right? And so what she says is that the core historical directive of policing has consistently been the defense of capital, land, and economic status through the brutal control of the working class, poor and racialized and other marginalized among them, not the universal protection and service of the community, right? And so as we think about what Hugh said before, right, that in defense of this specific civil society, right, they sent the National Guard down there to protect the buildings, right, the places that were being looted specifically, right? And so as we think about this, right, then we understand that these murders, these cagings, all these various different things are about control of us as a colonized population, so that we won't, rise up against these specific different contradictions, right? Because as we understand, right, oppression breeds resistance. So they know that resistance will come, and so they use armed means in terms of to control it, to stop it, right? And so last example of kind of resistance against the state in terms of armed means. And before talking about that example, I did want to ground us specifically in BAP self-defense principle of unity, where we say BAP is not a pacifist movement. While committed to peace, we understand that there can be no peace without justice, and we will stand in solidarity with all peoples and nations who strive to liberate themselves from oppression, right? So wanted to kind of ground in that specifically, but I wanted to talk about the Black Liberation Army. Had a big specific presence here in the Northeast area. And so the Liberation Army, born out of the repression of the Black Panther Party. And the BLA was a Black underground armed guerrilla group that took the fight against the state with armed actions against police and, quote unquote, fundraising through the means of bank robberies, right? And so wanted to just bring up, a little bit of their analysis and their understanding of why the need to do this, right? And so in their message to the movement, speaking to folks, they say, we therefore will illustrate only in the terms that the ruling class understand, the terms of blood, their blood. America must learn that Black people are not the internal sufferers, universal prisoners, the only ones who can feel pain. Revolutionary violence is not an alternative to mass movement and organization. It's complementary to mass struggle. It is another front in the total liberation process. And then I also want to bring up a quote from Dhoruba bin Wahad, former member of the Black Liberation Army, in the conversation that he had with Jared Ball on Black Liberation Media, in describing, the reasoning behind, right, the Black Liberation Army. He said that we felt that we were at war, that we were always at war, that our presence in America was an act of war, and that politics is a continuation of war by nonviolent means, and war is a continuation of politics by violent means, right? So again, his understanding of situating himself as, okay, there is a war on us as African Black people here, and that we need to have some way of responding to this. We need to have some way of protecting ourselves, right? And so that was manifested in the Black Liberation Army, right? And so I'm not here to specifically litigate whether we should go out and just start armed struggle right tomorrow, right? But I do want to bring up some analysis from Gerald Horne that I think brings me to my conclusion a little bit in terms of understanding, right, like how do we respond to war, right? If we understand that we are as Black African people are at war, that the state is against us, what do we kind of do to respond to that? And so in talking a little bit about the Black Panthers and about the Black Liberation Army in his book, Armed Struggle, and then he also had, different interviews around that, he says that the question is not necessarily in the country of the United States gaining access to arms. The question is having an analysis of the forces on the ground, the correlation of forces both domestically and globally that would allow one to prevail, right? So again, wrapping up, as we understand ourselves to be at war, we must build to prepare and to protect one another, right? And so whether we want to advocate for armed struggle in the way that the Black Liberation Army does, whether we wanted to advocate in terms of armed self-defense, whether we want to do nonviolent means, right? Our understanding has to be grounded in a material analysis of what's going on here and globally, and then also of our community, right? We need to understand who our quote unquote community is, who our folks are, how they're understanding things, right? To make these decisions in terms of figuring out the best way to prevail, right? And so again, I think for that, we defense breaking up. Can y'all hear me?
Hey, Josh, maybe try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Yep. All right. Just to off with from our recent Principle of Unity Study Circle at BAP NYC, we said that self-defense is not just a physical act, but a community building process that begins with social investigation that decides action. It is rooted in a deep collective understanding of our shared struggles and need to develop a unified political strategy. To be able to do that, we have to build community. We have to do social investigation to understand and to have a material analysis of the folks on the ground and to develop this unified in terms of combating this. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that strong analysis and the call to have a strong analysis for in thinking about what taking seriously the war on our people will require. As a basis, as a foundation, got to have that analysis. And so, yeah, thank you for that. And I did want to say that the images that you saw were from Newark in '67, and they were taken by a photographer named Bud Lee. And Bud Lee's son graciously gave us permission to use those images. And the book that you can find those images in is called "The War Is Here." And so it was also the inspiration for the title of tonight's webinar, that the war is still here. And so you can, if you wanted to see some of those images, many of which are very striking, you can check that book out. But thanks again, Comrade Josh. And to conclude our panel, we're going to turn to Ayana, who is a member of the BAP NYC NJ Citywide Alliance. And I'm just going to encourage y'all now, having seen this beforehand, get your pen ready, take good notes, because you're about to learn a lot, and it's going to be extremely useful for understanding the multiple ways that we're at war and how we can resist. So, Ayana, pass to you.
Thank you so much, JP. So hi, everyone. My name is Ayana Porter Cash. I'm going to be talking about psychological warfare, specifically focusing on agency and soft power. And I'm really interested in how the state wages war, not only through force and the armed power that we just heard about, but through the conditioning of our perceptions, relationships, and sense of possibility. And so how I think about this is through the scope of attention, agency, and alliances, particularly in the context of state violence and brutality, but also in labor and leisure, right? So attention is where we direct our energy and focus, consciously and unconsciously. Agency is the extent to which we feel we can enact change in response to our conditions. Alliances are with whom we practice solidarity and trust to pursue our liberation as their own. And again, we just heard about Dhoruba bin Wanhad, who says that public fear of state-sanctioned violence is a prerequisite for a social order that relies upon race and class for, quote, equal treatment under the law. And that's from Joy James Beyond Cop Cities book. So we often talk about how fear is manipulated to manufacture consent, but psychological warfare is not limited to fear. It also operates through entertainment media, mentorship, role models, and everyday visual and storytelling environments. So it's not just the news media priming us to see danger, it's also what we consume when our guard is down, like in leisure, and when it's up, especially under conditions of scarcity or insecurity, like in our labor. So this is about how the state conditions consciousness across everyday life, not just moments of crisis. So first, let's talk about some key terms, psychological warfare, and I'm drawing this right from BAP's research committee's glossary. Psychological warfare involves or refers to tactics that use propaganda, entertainment, as well as fear, terror, and other psychic means. And I want to talk a little bit more about those other psychic means to influence the opinions, emotions, attitudes, and behavior of opposition groups, particularly targeted populations, i.e. African, Black, and colonized peoples here in the US. So this works, of course, in tandem with the other forms of warfare. Don't want to spend too much time here, but I think it's just important that we have an understanding that power operates on different levels, right? We have the direct form of power, the armed military-grade weapons in the hands of local police, as we'll probably talk a little bit more about later. But really, I want to focus on agenda-setting power because this is where this is about what gets discussed, what gets normalized or erased so that it's hidden or excluded from the political arena, or is it prioritized there? And then we have collective consciousness. This is about what even we imagine to be an issue versus a non-event. And so this leads us to key questions like what is agency and with whom do we form alliances that support our self-determination? And then we have soft power, right? So this is where I think of what Joy James calls deadly entities with benign names, right? So soft power manipulates aid, cultural values, media, perceptions of legitimacy, all to exert control. It operates through goodwill as a smokescreen for dominance and counterinsurgency. And of course, by contrast, we have those forms of hard power, quote unquote, which are war and sanctions. So to better understand our conditions, we can look to Joy James' notion of military, police, law enforcement, industry. That's a long name to say. Basically, we understand the convergence of the militarization of police and the policification of military, right? So in BAP, we understand that anti-imperialism is central. We can't confront imperialism without understanding how it boomerangs back onto Black and colonized peoples within the US. And this shows up through what Joy James calls, again, this military police law enforcement industry, where the carceral systems and militarism operate together. And if we're going to talk about psychological warfare in the New York City region, we have to talk about Horace Nami Burton's analysis in Tip of the Spear, which focuses on the long Attica revolt, right? This protracted accumulation of rebellion. So just like the state's oppression doesn't happen overnight, neither does rebellion. There are these accumulations. And Burton shows that psychological warfare is part of soft power, and also that reforms are often deployed to pacify resistance. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that, but also to reinscribe the legitimacy of the system. And this is especially important when the state is using Black representation to pass these reforms, right? This Black misleadership class that Jibo was talking about. And in developmental psychology, we know that feeling Black and beautiful can become an endpoint in and of itself in terms of racial identity development, right? Representation can contain rather than mobilize political struggle. So we want to make sure that we're being aware of how representation functions as a stabilizer of the political status quo, not as liberation. And research shows that, of course, police brutality is not exceptional, right? It's not just these viral incidents. It's Lisa Boleg, Black psychologist, describes it as a continuum of everyday structural violence, right? This reframes state violence as constant and normalized and embedded in our everyday life. So that helps to better understand how this is happening on a psychological level as well. So let's get to some local examples. A very recent high-profile example of brutality and this sort of obedient trust propaganda converging would be the December 2024 murder of Robert Brooks. During a transfer between facilities, body cam footage shows that the so-called correctional officers beat Robert until he was within an inch of his life while he was handcuffed to a medical table, and he died the next day. And I have listed here some other high-profile cases in New York City region. But basically, I'm listing these all here to show how brutality and legitimacy operate together. So while New York Governor Kathy Hochul has expressed condolences for these, what she calls tragedies, we also know that some officers have still not been charged, right? Others had their sentences reduced, and correctional officers, quote unquote, then launched this wildcat strike. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, I want to say that criminal legal reforms have passed in recent years, right? It's not like we haven't made any what we call progress, right? So we have the HALT Solitary Confinement Act, we have the Eric Garner Anti-Chokehold Act, which wouldn't have saved Eric Garner, right? But we have all these reforms. And then we also have, to lay the context for you, we also have in New York the fact that the CEOs have been on this wildcat strike, right? And basically, this strike has been happening all around the state with more than 30 prisons involved. And one of the demands from this strike was to repeal that HALT law, that HALT solitary law, which basically says that there will be more restrictions on how you can use solitary confinement. And so the CEOs really wanted to repeal this. And even though they're striking, this is a wildcat strike because they don't have the, the approval of their union leaders, they didn't end up getting the HALT solitary repealed, but they did get a 90-day suspension. And more importantly, DOCS, the Department of Correctional Community Services, has been planning an aggressive hiring campaign, right? Because New York fired thousands of guards for striking, and then Governor Kathy Hochul sent in the National Guard to make up the difference in the meantime, right? So while the state responds with symbolic reforms and selective accountability, this is what Burton is describing as reformist pacification, right? Because they appear progressive and they offer meaningful change, or they seem to, but they're very fragile and they're tenuous because they're tied to the state, and they are actively resisted by people situated within the state's carceral forces. So then the question becomes, what does this reform pacification cycle do to our sense of agency? For that, I want to take us to the Black political psychology framework, which basically is to describe this framework centers how psychological warfare operates on consciousness itself, right? Both through political death and through political life. So political death being menticide, political life, I want to talk about how that's constrained through invisible weapons. But first, menticide. So menticide is the systematic deconstruction of African consciousness, right? So Evan August describes the menticide as a framework for understanding the internalizing and externalizing manifestations of psychological distress as shaped by socio-political effects of structural anti-Blackness. So what does this mean? It's like, what is the psychological impact of all the other types of warfare that we've been hearing about? And Kobe Cambone extends this to say that menticide is a fundamental assault on the versatility of African consciousness itself, right? And I think that part is really important because it's about how we imagine what's possible. So menticide operates by severing access to our cultural knowledge, right? Our sense of self and our sense of people, erasing our histories of resistance and obscuring the conditions of domination. So if one cannot understand themselves or their history, they can't recognize the forces acting against them, right? Or even when the enemy is speaking through us. And this is why cultural knowledge is restricted, because it is a fertile ground for liberation. And we know that, again, this strategy of white supremacy is acknowledgement of the fact that the state knows that knowledge of self and cultural orientation is directly tied to our ability to resist. Well, we can also generalize. Let's look out a little bit further and see how psychological warfare draws on known mechanisms of social influence, right? Through normalization, through obedience, through conformity, through the fear of rejection and exclusion, but also through specific tactics, right? And so I thought that this article, this is a journalist, they're not a psychologist, but they did a really good job of highlighting how this shows up specifically for Black and Brown people around the carceral system and the military. And so we see that we not only do we have specific tactics that recruiters are using, like that psychologist champion as social control methods, right? Foot in the door technique, lowballing, feigned scarcity. And then this is all happening within the context of course, these material conditions that we were talking about before. And I also think it's really important that we see, okay, so these are the specific social control tactics. Now let's start thinking about this in the context of how the military works and how the police works in terms of loss of individuality, reversal of predator and dispossessed, right? These are mechanisms used to recruit, discipline, and stabilize participation in the state's systems of violence. Now, the invisible weapons framework explains how agency becomes compartmentalized. So people may resist in some areas, but comply in others. And this is particularly salient under neoliberalism, because that's where people are learning to accept their position, right? Their place in society. It offers common sense explanations that reinforce domination. And basically, the invisible weapons framework is highlighting how this apparent contradiction between resisting in some areas but complying in others reflects spaces where choice is constrained, especially under surveillance. So Marcus Ford Jr. shows that disengagement is highest where the state has the greatest control. This includes spaces like transit systems, schools, carceral systems, carceral environments. So specifically, individual weapons, and I had it on this last slide, are these three in the definition, these three bullets in the definition, right? This cooperative resistance, these individualistic hard work narratives or beliefs, and then this personal responsibility narrative. Basically taking the blame where structures and systems should instead, because we know that without autonomy, without that sense of agency, people are less likely to seek systemic accountability. And now we have procedural justice, which is traditional Western psychology, mainstream psychology, how psychologists are thinking about how does the public think about what is legitimate? Is the state legitimate? Well, procedural justice in this theory of legitimacy policing argues that legitimacy comes from fair processes, not outcomes, right? So this leaves the racist capitalist logic underlying the system intact. It redirects critique away from structural violence, and it soothes the cognitive dissonance around the fact that we know that the system is oppressive and racist, inherently so, and yet we're being told that this is the main route that we should seek safety and accountability and justice, right? So it acknowledges harm just enough to maintain belief in the system. And it reuses, as you can see here in this blue, with the blue background, it uses relational trust to manipulate legitimacy and facilitate recruitment. So when I say recruitment, you might be thinking, well, do you mean just for the military? No, I also mean through all aspects of the criminal legal system. So this is an article written literally published March 23rd, so just this week, on judiciary recruitment, calls to increase Black representation in the judiciary, reflecting this same logic of procedural justice, right? They're saying representation, they're framing representation as justice. But this, again, reinforces the legitimacy of the system. It narrows our imagination away towards just being putting our hope in the Black misleadership class, and it ties justice to these existing institutions, right? So this is identity politics as stabilization, not transformation. But how is this, again, related to recruiting? Well, we see these, again, the reductionist identity politics, we see respectability politics, right? The judge is talking about, if you see in the top left corner, that there's a collegial effect. We need more Black representation in the judiciary because that's the ultimate cure for racism. When white judges see other Black judges, that's how they know to not dehumanize Black people. That's the logic there. let's go on to some targeted recruitment, right? So these are photos that I've taken around New York City, around New Jersey, everyday transit spaces, right? And they target attention in our environments, our visual environments that are already saturated with state power. I just came from the train station. There are many officers there with guns almost as big as my body, right? But all these ads are around, and they're offering jobs, they're offering benefits, they're offering stability, right? They're queuing in on these master narratives around the good life, right? And they really rely on economic vulnerability. As noted, poverty is one of the military's most effective recruiting tools, right? That's what many call the poverty draft. If you listen to the Black Agenda Radio episode from March 13th, you're going to hear Margaret and Erica talk about this, right? So these ads are also using DEI, right? They're using Black men and women to normalize militarism and to obscure its function. They link identity, right, this reductionist sense of identity, to state violence in a way that seems positive. And they frame enlistment as protection and as opportunity. We also see this carry out with ICE and other immigration detention officers. Now let's look at Yonkers, right? Here in New York, again, we have what they call themselves the Guardians, and they use mentorship to recruit young Black men to become police officers. The strategy is, again, they're meeting real social needs, mentorship, they're building trust, they're creating relational pathways into policing, right? But it's also predatory. It expands state power through proximity. And this is, again, soft power operating through relationships. And I think it's really interesting also that what they say, this officer who's doing this NPR interview, he's describing how he wants to recruit more Black people because it's really hard to move up in the ranks, because he's a Black police officer right now, without having more people to fill in underneath them. So again, we can see how, and then you can see, we teach a class on test prep. Our intent is to get all of us on the job, right? And then you see in the blue, one of the young people saying, it looked like the Avengers. I've never seen so many Black cops there ever. And this person was remarking on just feeling really supported because these people had showed up for her during her test. And we know that recruitment heavily targets youth, right? Especially in under-resourced schools. Military recruiters are in most high schools in the US. JROTC exists in 1 in 4 urban schools. Recruitment is concentrated where economic options are limited, right? And the ROTC, or the reserves, was always about funneling young people into the military. In 1916, the National Guard and the establishment of the National Defense Act formally established ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, to train specifically, and this is a quote, to train and prepare high school and college students for Army service, right? And in 2024, the RAND Corporation released a report highlighting that only 5% of high schools have failed to provide what recruiters consider to be adequate access. So what does that mean? Almost 95% of high schools in the United States are giving access to recruiters to our young ones. And if you listen to popular news media, you might be under the misconception that the military is still facing a recruitment crisis, but I'm here to tell you that they're using relational tactics and they're doing it effectively. The US military brought in over 200,000 recruits in 2024. That's a 12% increase from the last year. So despite narratives of recruitment crisis, we're actually seeing as a recruitment surge. And we could talk all day about recruitment trends, but how does recruitment actually play out? I want to talk about that through video games, entertainment media, mentorship programs, right? The military has even developed its own video game. On the left here, you'll see it. And it is one of the top 10 of all video games, online or otherwise, right? The military uses these video games to recruit. And like many innovations, America's Army, this video game didn't grow out of a strategic plan, right? But then the Pentagon figured out that it was going to be a strong recruiting tool. The state also uses programs like March to Success to surveil youth under the guise of relational opportunity, mentorship, or leadership programs, right? They offer support. They function as surveillance and a pipeline expansion. in this way, recruitment is also expanding they're redefining who is recruitable, right? By going into this domain. So the language of opportunity and service and protection has always been the key sales pitch. And we know this is recycled from military recruiting Black people out of the South in the 20th century. But in the digital age, we have to extend our collective self-defense to be conscious of the relational, and not just language and policy memos and pundits rhetoric, but also the fact that they're targeting young people specifically through video games and other media. So really quickly, I just want to say that as someone who's studying psychology, I would be remiss if I didn't say that psychology has long been aligned with the state, right? The Hoffman report shows that psychologists help to design torture, and then they help to redesign their own ethics to permit it. Again, that Black Agenda Radio episode talks a little bit about that. And I also want to share that my research has shown, and I share that there on the right-hand side, that psychology has also been used to undermine protests, Black people's protests of state violence, to justify state violence, and to shape public perception. And so in this way, psychological knowledge itself becomes a tool of war. And we know that media representation often serves as cover, right? It encourages the conflation of Black identity, militarism, carceral systems, and this normalization of participation. This normalizes participation in violent institutions. And just as a note here, this is right from the APA. The APA's motive to please the Department of Defense is that the Department of Defense was one of the largest employers of psychologists. And this goes all the way back to, and you should Google this, Project Camelot, Project Troy. They've been at it for a long time, this alliance between psychology and the state. So what I have here are just a bunch of examples that you can find on Netflix or movies that have popular come out, and they are making Black characters, they're making Black characters the main characters, and that is no coincidence. We also have films like Top Gun, which function as explicit propaganda for the Department of War. And we know that this is, by the way, on the right-hand side, this is the Department of War's website where they're explicitly promoting Top Gun, this movie. So we know the Department of War collaborates with media and they use film to promote militarism. Even when it's not centered on Blackness, they're reshaping our ideological terrain, but also our psychological vulnerability to that terrain. In conclusion, psychological warfare operates through language and through silence, right? It operates through fear, but also through humor and relatability, and also through representation and relationships. And it does this to disorient our political consciousness, to compartmentalize our agency, and to reduce our ability to organize in collective struggle. And so we have to ask, what stories do we consume without critique? What feels natural but is conditioned? And ultimately, what does this mean for how we understand ourselves and fight the war that is being waged against us? Thank you.
Thank you, Ayana. That question is I feel like a perfect way to sum up what all the panelists have said. How do we fight the war that's being waged against us? And yeah, I appreciate you breaking down all the various assaults that come on us, even when we feel like everything is we're just going about our day. It's important for us to be aware of that, so we can have a collective psychological self-defense. So yeah, thank you for that. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first question I just wanted to address in terms of the list of resources that have been shared and talked about. We will do our best to very quickly turn around a list a document that has a list of all the resources that were shared and mentioned tonight, and so we can get those out. And the first question, which was a really good one, I think this one is probably for Jibo, I would say, is, one second. uh, yeah, why do you think counter-revolutionary or fascist ideologies dominate revolutionary progressive ideology? And is there a country where it's the opposite? So why is the right side of the triangle doing the most, Jibo?
Well, at this point in history, imperialism led by U.S. imperialism and NATO, for example, uh, dominate dominate the world as a economic system. Capitalism dominates the world, and especially this U.S. fascist form of it is dominating the world economically, politically, um, ideologically in many ways. Um, but in the global South countries, there is resistance. That's why, for example, in Latin America, they coined a phrase called the pink tide, which I think is a good phrase because the tide goes back and forth like the sea, and that means there's constant struggle. That means that right side of that triangle is constantly trying to beat down the progressive forces in the world, in the global South, and including in the metropoles of imperialist countries. And but at this point in time, there are very few countries that where the left side of the triangle dominates. And I would say China, Vietnam, to name two. Those are the ones I can think of off the top, because they control their political economy in the interest of their populations. And they've declared socialism. They're controlled by their politics is controlled by communist parties. Now, on the continent, we do have the AES countries, but they're a little more they're emerging in a sense of I call them a resource nationalist countries that don't have necessarily or not led by revolutionary parties that have declared socialism, but they are organizing their economy in the interest. um, they're in motion, they're in development, they're trying to organize their economy in the interest of their population. And so but those countries are still fragile because imperialism doesn't sleep and is constantly trying to undermine those efforts, uh, like they like they undermine Venezuela. They're choking Cuba. They're attacking always Nicaragua and other Latin American countries and African countries, and Asian countries as well. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
Appreciate that, comrade. Um, yeah, so a couple more questions in the chat. And I feel like there were two questions about sanctions, and so I think that these might be good for Justin Frames, but feel free to answer anyone. I think there was a question that asked, wouldn't sanctions be an example of soft power? But then also there was a question that came in, can panelists share domestic examples of how internally colonized people in the U.S. Experience sanctions or forms of economic dispossession comparable to sanctions? Yeah, so those two are open to anyone, but I think Justin Frames might be equipped for that.
Yeah,
I
I
just
have a
want to
thought.
say a quick note on the soft power because I think that was me saying that. So I mentioned soft power might be an example I mean, I mentioned sanctions might be an example of hard power, and I'm drawing that from the understanding that these are like, as like I think either Jackie or Margaret calls them like unilateral coercive measures taken by one state over another, and they're in that way they're these forms of hard power because they're like directly one has direct power over another in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, one kind of sanction in the last few years has been the Canary mission, I think has been a form of sanctions. If for folks who are not familiar, this the Zionist site that puts up all of the folks they can find who are organizing for Palestine, puts them on a list, and essentially they were trying to reverse BDS and create a series of penalties, and then actually even and they framed it as that. They said this will be able to go after the college students will know their potential employers will know about them and that this could be their consequence, and in which case we can kind of herd them. It was also a psychological thing, it is that it's an ongoing thing to herd people away from doing that, and then and actually go to employers and say, do you know that you are currently paying for that, right? Another example I think of economic sanctions were when they tried to they were successful in money that was going to Louis Farrakhan from Gaddafi for Black people and stop that, right? That's another kind of sanction. And maybe the last one, one major sanction I think is, I mean, prisons are a huge sanction. I mean, once you're in there, getting resources to people, you can be penalized for all kinds of absurdities inside the whole thing, and then its effect on your family, cash bail. There's a lot of ways I think that you can see different kinds of trying to change behavior through through that. Yeah. One example you have, Frank, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one to come to mind. And before I say it, I think it's a really interesting question too. And I appreciate it because I feel like making that connection between the international and domestic is important for us to understand the way this war is waged on African peoples in both contexts. And I think an interesting difference between them too is the way, right? Maybe if we're talking about a nation that has sanctions put against it, um, the state in the sense of or the 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 status of a nation's right self-determination, we might look at that differently from how we look at like us in a domestic situation too. So I think there's a lot of the economic abuse and economic war on African peoples domestically that it looks different, takes a different shape, and maybe like might not look exactly the same as what sanctions look like, but something that's similar that comes to mind immediately is one is when we look at the continuum, say from segregation to redlining, and the use of, tax dollars, federal, dollars, state dollars, to invest intentionally, right, to invest in non-African communities, non-African white specifically, white districts or communities, right? And an intentional disinvestment in African communities. And we see that all throughout that continuum. Like when we learn about segregation, we listen to that rhetoric of separate but not equal and understand that one of the main issues around segregation is the part that this separation, there was separation and unequal investment, right? Unequal access to resources. And the next thing that comes to mind, I think, is uh, the FEMA response, right? The federal response to Hurricane Katrina, and other, natural disasters. But Katrina was like a big one, right? Where we understand when we look back at what happened with Katrina, there's no realistic logistical explanation for such a poor response, such a deadly response for African peoples in New Orleans, in Louisiana, except for the fact that this is a war being waged against African peoples, right? And so I think that's one example that, to me, the Katrina example relates very much to, that's what comes to mind when I think of, say, like what we're looking at with Cuba today, just in the sense that there's an intentional effort to reduce, to diminish, to worsen the living conditions for the people that the capital class seeks to colonize and seeks to oppress. And yeah, so those are the two that come to mind for me.
Yeah, thank you. And just a couple of quick follow-up points. I think that on the question of soft power and sanctions, we recently done an internal study for the Northeast, BAP Northeast, and we read Woodrow Wilson's views on what sanctions are, and he refers to them as a weapon more tremendous than war. And he also uses like the language and the image of suffocation, like, so it is very much like a hard power tactic of war, I would say. And yeah, and the other point was, yeah, Frames, I appreciate that you brought up New Orleans and Katrina, because it was Cuba and Venezuela that offered material support when the U.S. didn't during Katrina. And so I think that's a really good testament to what coordination and solidarity looks like. So yeah. One last question, and then we will move to a close before we let y'all eat a late dinner or go to bed. Is for Justin and Frames. Were there Black entities or people who served as a buffer class to support the Black removal that took place in Pittsburgh?
Can you say that again? What was the question? Say it again. Oh,
Yeah, were there Black entities / people who served as a buffer class to support the Black removal that took place in Pittsburgh?
yeah. I mean, I think when it came to the Black removal, I don't recall that part where it's direct, where when the initial acts were issued and you saw people come out in favor of that. I think it gets to the different issue. I think so in that time period, I would just say, and then go to Frames. I don't know of anyone who came out and said, "I'm for this," right? But I think the issue of a class behavior could be in the way that how was it not protested? How did life go on? Right, to I think some of the things that Ayanna was raising, right? Like, so how might it just be that all you really have to do to facilitate is just to continue to live your life as though it's not needing to be confronted? And in that way, for sure, there's a lot, I think, of that you could say from that time period and the ongoing um, uh, way in which uh, so I mean, I'll say that, but I think for sure that is a piece of it. The way that you have, obviously Black council people, they're not necessarily going to be like saying I'm on board with this, right? But there is still something in the way that you're going to still have this, like when we the one part was a community benefits agreement, and we signed a deal as a part of that with the Penguins, with the city of Pittsburgh, right? So there's, I think, definite participation in the Black upper working class. Yeah, 100%. That's a part of the war for sure.
Yeah, I wouldn't really add much to it. I think Justin, you summed it up really well. If anything, I'd say I appreciate you referenced Ayana's presentation. I think both Ayana and Jibo touched on this thing in a way that kind of connected. I think when we're talking about these kinds of neoliberal, neocolonial, reformist kind of politics that show up, I think there's a class element to that. And Jibo, when you showed your diagram, the pyramid, and you talked about the way the counter-revolutionary ideology is constantly fighting against and winning, and usually making up the majority of what we see, I think it poses just an interesting challenge for us that we're still trying to figure out, and we're constantly trying to figure out on all levels, local, national, and beyond, of how to approach that, right? How to understand like winning this war. All these different elements, ideological, economic, armed, psychological, they all work in tandem. They all work together. And that's what makes this so deep and so tough. So it's like, I think that's also like an important takeaway for today is just that while these things are working in tandem, we have to fight all of them in tandem. Um, because, our people, this is also a war for, our people's minds, our people's, hearts, as one of our comrades in the BSF often says. So, um, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Frames. And it is a war that is constant. It's coming on all fronts, coordinated, and we have to be prepared for how we respond. And toward that end, just wanted to say, we've offered up a definition of war, but wanted to also raise our definition of peace, which I think is very important. That peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the achievement, and I think this is very, very important, by popular struggle and self-defense of a world liberated from interlocking issues of global conflict, nuclear armament and proliferation, unjust war and subversion, through the defeat of global systems of oppression that include colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. And I think that just about every one of our panelists described some form of, or the need for some form of popular struggle and self-defense. Because while this is a war that has been being waged on us, that we never asked for, that we've been drawn into an eternal war of choice on African people, it has never been a one-sided war. And it can't be now. And so it's something that if we do want peace, and if we do want to move that left side of the triangle, it will have to come through popular struggle and self-defense. I wanted to raise, I know that some folks have been making some comments in the chat, particularly Comrade Ajamu, about some of the demands of our No Compromise, No Retreat campaign. If you ever heard a Black Alliance for Peace person speak, you probably heard them say "No compromise, no retreat." But for us, that's not a slogan. It is definitely it's one of our campaigns, and we want to defeat the war against African Black people in the U.S. and abroad, the war that we've defined and been talking about all night. And some of the priority demands of that are abolishing the Department of War's 1033 program, which transfers military-grade equipment to local police departments. Another priority demand is to end the deadly exchange, to stop Israeli training of U.S. police and law enforcement, and all collaborations with and support of forces of Zionist occupation. And a third demand is to stop cop cities and cop nation, to end the development and construction of cop cities, which are popping up all over the country, and to prioritize funds towards people-centered human rights and needs of our African Black colonized working class and poor peoples and communities. And then some other priority demands are to end economic warfare that Justin and Frames laid out so beautifully in terms of analysis, end economic warfare on our people and our neighborhoods, and defend African Black working class and poor people in our neighborhoods by confronting economic attacks, including austerity policies, privatization and expropriation of land, and human needs, and capitalist exploitation of our labor, resources, and people. And you can see like the threads of the definition showing up in these demands. And then finally, priority demand is to shut down ICE and address the imperialist root causes of forced and coerced migration, to end the criminalization of migration and dehumanization of migrating peoples, and defend against the violations of sovereignty that create the conditions for coerced and forced displacement and migration. One of the examples that Josh brought up was Jean Wilson Brutus, who did move from Haiti seeking asylum. And that's right right in line with this this demand to address the imperialist root causes because of the U.S. imperialist trespassing in Haiti, which you can read more about in the CMB Newark statement that I believe was shared in the chat. And, you know, for this campaign, if you are in Philadelphia, if you're in Pittsburgh, if you're in New York City or New Jersey, you will likely hear folks talk about this campaign, and you will start to begin to hear folks talk about ways that these kinds of demands can be localized to address specific specific conditions that are in those cities and in other places throughout the Northeast. So I did want to take a quick moment to talk about some upcoming actions and events. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., there will be a coalition of folks who will be meeting at 500 Pearl Street at 8 a.m. to have court support for President Nicolas Maduro and First Combatant Celia Flores, who are being held at Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. And you know, we'll be out there showing our support, showing our solidarity, and showing that this will, you know, that we will be confronting and we will be resisting. We have not, although the media has forgotten about, you know, or has been quiet about Maduro and Flores, we will not be quiet, and we are going to continue to resist and let them know that that we're out there, and we're going to keep on letting them know that we're out there until they are freed and returned and given their place as the rightful constitutional president and first combatant that they are. And also, just as an extension of that, every, you know, since Maduro and Flores were captured on the and abducted on the 3rd of January, every month on the 3rd of every month, we do go out to Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn to let them know and let the Venezuelan people know that they are not forgotten and that we are standing with them and with the Bolivarian Project. So yeah. And then also on Saturday at from 2 to 4, Mass Rising and the New York City, New Jersey Citywide Alliance are putting on an event called Reclaiming Our Sea, where we'll have a 3 or 4 panelists to talk about the Caribbean and Venezuela, and that'll be held at Medgar Evers College, and yeah, that'll be from 2 to 4, and then and that will be the first session, and then the next session will be in April. Almost at the finish line, y'all. One other action, so tomorrow's a full day. 8 a.m. you can be out at Pearl Street, and then 8 p.m. You can be at this webinar, which is we'll talk more about the Move the Games campaign that Jibo referenced at the beginning of this webinar. And you know, we'll talk more about why the U.S. does not deserve to host the games, and we'll talk about what it will look like to build coordinated resistance to boycott the World Cup being in the U.S. and also to boycott the United States. So stay tuned in and please register for that. You can see the bit.ly link there. Move the Games. So that's happening tomorrow at 8 p.m. And then, yeah, I wanted to, if you're in the Pittsburgh area, this is another event you can go to, and I'll let Justin or Frames speak to this.
Yeah, great. Thanks, JP. Yeah, so this is going to be notes from prisoners of war. This is going to be honoring Joseph Jojo Bowen. You can see more about him on the Jericho Movement site. But Jojo Bowen has been incarcerated for more than 50 years. He was incarcerated initially for the responding to a police officer shooting him by killing that police officer, and then killed a warden and a deputy warden inside. But again, after having the war taken to him, and he is. We get this initiation from a brother inside named Jerome Coffey, who's been incarcerated himself for 30 plus years, who wants to see more attention given to Jojo Bowen. And the question Jojo is really asking from the inside is, are we organized for war? And he wants people who are organizers and such to look at their organizations and ask, are we organized for the enemy that we're dealing with? He's been confronting this enemy face to face for 50 years, has all the horrific injuries to show for that, and hasn't yielded to the call, no compromise, no retreat. Jojo Bowen embodies that. That you have to be in Pittsburgh though to go to that. That's not going to be online.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, I appreciate that that question. It's an important one. Are we prepared, and how do we get there? Yeah, and if you do want to stay connected with the Black Alliance for Peace or any of the organizations that were on the webinar tonight, on Instagram, BAP New York City. You could also follow CMB Newark at cmb.newark, and then BAP Philadelphia at BAP Philadelphia, and then the Black Socialist Formation at Black SOC Form. And yeah, that's a way that you can find out about these events that are in your area if you're in any of these places, and also just stay connected with us and learn about future events that are that are happening. And of course, if you're looking for a formation, even though I did forget about BAP NYC&J earlier, I am a proud member of the Black Alliance for Peace, and I encourage all people, Black and African, and also Black and non-African folks, to join the Black Alliance for Peace. If you're non-African, you can join our Solidarity Network, which does absolutely phenomenal work in conjunction and coordination with the formation. And yeah, also if you're a part of an organization that agrees with those weapons of war that Jibo referenced, our principles of unity, then your organization can also be a member organization of the Black Alliance for Peace. And so you can go to blackallianceforpeace.com/join and find out the process for how that works. And I know it was a marathon, but it's a protracted struggle, and we will continue to face it, because, as we said, the war that's being waged against us is really a counter-revolution trying to suppress our striking a blow for freedom, as Henry Highland Garnett might say. And so, as we say in the Black Alliance for Peace, when it comes to peace, when it comes to people-centered rights, people-centered human rights, there can be no compromise and absolutely no retreat. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.